Hello, everyone. This is Papa Smithy, and you're on Thorin's YouTube channel, so brace yourself for some banter.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Narrative Wake, and our guest for this one is going to be Veggie, who you might know from way back in the day. He was the coach of ROCCAT, the Polish lineup. Later on, also worked with some other Polish teams. But actually, when he now speaks, you will be like, wait a minute, is he even Polish? Like, go on, start speaking to us in English with that ridiculous American
Hello,
accent.
how are you doing, my friend?
Yeah, he doesn't sound anything like that.
I've had to learn how to emulate the English-Polish accent throughout the years when I talk with European players and stuff. You know, I know how to emulate, the Polish English thing, Polish, that's what we call it.
Because the thing that would shock people is obviously because of your association, especially with that ROCCAT team, the all-Polish one, and then in later years with some of the teams you've worked with, people would just assume you're only from Poland. It's the opposite way around, that you'd have broken English or you've developed it. Like, what is your actual background? Were you born in the US? Were you born in Poland? How did this come about?
Yeah, I was born in the US in 1990, and I lived there for 11 years. So, like, 4th grade or 5th grade, I moved to Poland because my Polish parents, they ran away from communism. They went to America. They met up. Kids come out, and then they came back to Poland because university is free here, right? So that's basically the story. But, like, going back to Polish teams and things like that, this started out actually when I was a player. I played a lot with Kikis, and this is one of the players that I've been with throughout many teams. And whenever he left our Polish super team lineup, I was one of the ones also with Pookie style that were always pissed at him that, why are you going to the European teams, man?
Sure. You don't appreciate you. Yeah.
I'm serious. I'll tell you why I had an approach like that for many years. It was because of the Golden Five. It's their fault, because in Counter-Strike, right? Every team was national, and they were the best. Like, people would be looking up to them from other esports. The first LAN I went to in Poland, we were just shouting at the other team shit during the match, right? Because it's just how it's done in Counter-Strike.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and we're looking at the Golden Five. They were actually at that tournament, to be fair, so that was kind of funny. But that's basically that. Those were our role models. You have to have a 5 Polish man lineup, and that's why I was never in European teams.
Yes, if people don't know, by the way, the background to that is in Counter-Strike, but even though if anyone followed Counter-Strike 1.6, like, you'd think all the greatest teams were Swedish, right? Because Sweden was always on top and they just always had like the champions and stuff. But people might not know this. The actual players who have the most majors, like the equivalent to World Championships in Counter-Strike 1.6, is Polish players, but only from this one lineup where they literally just kept this 5-man lineup for like 3.5 years, and they were almost never the actual number one team, but they just were amazing when they came to the majors. So as a result, like, the philosophy there, unlike every other region, the thing is, if you're in a region with loads of good players, it's like in League of Legends, every season you change a player, or you try to upgrade a player, or you get this guy who was your rival to join you. Instead, what they did is, their secret basically was you just have the same 5 players, and no matter what happens, because by the way, Kelsey, like, they were not, you might be thinking, wait a minute, 3.5 years, they must have been like really cool guys who just got along. They were going ham, they were fucking literally sometimes fist fighting each other. But the difference is they understood the principle of, like, no matter what happens, as long as in the server you get it back together again, you can look past all the rest of it. So the philosophy with them was like the opposite to every other team. Basically, their philosophy was like, just if you just tweak the little things, that's what will get us back to the top. Whereas, like, the reason why people do big roster moves is it's just the most easy way to cheat to get the same result, isn't it? Like, if you just get the right player who just happens to play awesome, you instantly solve the problem. So that's interesting, because obviously, like, people can think of some of the teams you've been in where that was the philosophy. And also, yeah, I agree with you. Shame on you, Kickers. Why are you going around chasing everyone, trying to find love in all the wrong places with those Europeans? Come back to where people actually appreciate you, mate. Exactly. And by the way, when you say that you
line up for LCS, instead of
really?
One, and I quit, and I said no because now I have the best roster ever. Because we were going to kick Shushay in this LFL team. Right. It was me, Vander, Kikis, and we were supposed to take Overpow mid. And 2 weeks later, Overpow says, "Nah, I'm going to go to another team." And so I messed up my LCS chance there. So that's when I quit and I became a coach, right?
Okay. I'm glad you actually explained as well that you were in multiple teams with Kikis, because saying, like, I played with Kikis is like saying, like, I got a free fucking toy in my Happy Meal. So, yeah, everyone did, mate. Like,
you know what? With the whole Pookie style thing, right? Like, it's been everywhere, right? Like SKT and stuff. Every org has been changing to Pookie style. This is the guy that I know 10 years. The first team he ever played in was with me and with Sulliver from ROCCAT. So they were as a duo. I don't know where they met each other, but we were supposed to go to the tournament I was talking about before, where the Golden Five was actually in Counter-Strike also.
Okay.
And they chickened out. Pookie Style and Silver chickened out. They didn't come to the tournament, and we got second place behind the NYM guys. So, Mokata, Makler, and those guys. So, throughout the 10 years, there's a gazillion history books to be written about the Polish scene, League of Legends, and shit like that.
Oh, don't worry, listen, mate. We'll do like a one-on-one interview where we just go deep on this shit. I also love that as well, right? That's how you know, because there's the thing, actually, if people don't know, another thing about Poland is it always had a very healthy LAN scene, which is how actually Counter-Strike came up as a game. So it doesn't surprise me that even in League of Legends you had loads of LANs, because that's another classic thing that doesn't exist now because of the way the pro scene works. Like, I don't know if you ever had this in your era, Kelsey, but it was classic that the people who were onliners weren't just bad because they were onliners and people wondered if they cheated. It's that when the LAN would come and they talk all that shit about how they were going to prove it, they just literally wouldn't turn up. They would just dodge the LAN completely. And you were like, what the fuck? Like, we've been waiting months to see these guys. Then they would just dodge. And you were like, that's what would make people have like the worst reps ever. Everyone just assume you cheat or you're a coward or something,
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. There's a lot of like stuff with local scenes that I think a lot of Americans missed, right? But it was really deep in places like China too, right?
So, and Korea, right? I mean, because the US is so big, that's why it's the problem.
Yeah.
Like, it's so big, but it also has like, in terms of the retention of competitive gamers who like aren't just playing for fun, like the culture of video gaming is very much more for fun, I would say.
Sure.
So I think that's like why. That's also part of why like a big LAN scene didn't develop. But you also see these like the documentary with the Smash scene. Like there was like
there's some grassroots elements. Yeah,
there's always like a little bit here and there. But like then you compare it to stuff like some of the history of China. One of my Chinese journalist friends gave me a book that was like behind the curtain. It was effectively what the title translates to, which is the history of the Chinese esports scene. And it was just like really, really detailed in terms.
I was getting really scared by the title. Okay, it was actually just about. It was a metaphorical criticism. Thank God.
Y'all got political,
I know exactly. I was like, Kelsey, listen, of all my co-hosts, not you as well, please.
But it's very detailed, talking about like basically a bunch of stuff was galvanized just from players coming up, like an individual player coming up, and then a bunch of like LANs would just sprout up to like beat this guy, right? So it's just really to see stuff like that. So like players would build LANs off of like the popularity of one player.
Anyway, we will now transition to talking about the topic. So what's interesting is people are going to think that's weird. They actually like had a conversation there. They talked about other things, different things. Well, all right, you complain either way. So normally when it's the 4.5 minute segment where I'm just being braggadocious, just calling out people in the industry, saying everyone else's shit, for the first like 30 episodes, just hinting at what the name narrative might mean without saying it, just because that's the sort of asshole I am. I think that's funny, even though it's not. It's like the name wasn't even that sick when I revealed it. It was like, you name a fucking show, everyone's names are garbage. Like, I at least didn't name mine off something in the game, like the fucking knock up or something. I at least went for something, didn't I? I tried to do something, even if I failed. So, right, here's the premise for the episode. This is why we have Veggie. This is actually going to be one that the premise initially will sound weird and you'll wonder why we've picked this guest, because if you don't know, we now tailor the show specifically to the guest we have. So the premise is one of the most important innovations in the game, one of the sort of like moments you can sort of make as a chapter ending in League of Legends, was the Samsung White team, which obviously culminated in winning Worlds and had its own effects in as much as obviously the Korean Exodus and all that stuff. But it's actually the most essential thing to me was when Dandy and Mata, support and jungle duo, other way around on that, respectively, when they were basically created this style of how to control the map and how to use vision control, this is what's interesting, because I noticed this used to happen in Korean StarCraft a lot, there's a difference between someone doing something genius that only they can do. Like, you can watch all the faker VODs from back in the day you want. You're not going to do that shit. Like, there's probably about 5 people alive who could even attempt it. But the interesting innovations to me are the ones that you can kind of download, and in theory, as long as you understand the principle, anyone can apply them. And I think to me, the things that they did here, the reason I know that this was what happened is I talked to so many players over the years who would just say, oh, that's basically how we learned like modern League of Legends. Like, I think NateDOhDoubleG basically said every team in Europe did that for like the next few years. It was just the way you played the game. So I've been purposely vague there because of the three people, I'm not the perfect person to talk about this. I've got two more knowledgeable people here. And if people don't know, here's the intro. The reason we got Veggie for this episode is because basically, since I've made this comment in the past when they were in the same team, that Jankos and Vander, just because of how good they were at their positions, the fact that they obviously had really good communication with each other, and they were a support jungle duo, I always said they should have been the Dandy and Mata of Europe. Like, it was logical. They should play together as long as they can. They've got great synergy. You should just put pieces around them, basically, like those Samsung teams did. And when I've said that over the years, people have told me, oh, it's not even just that they should have. Like, basically, the coach of that team, who was Veggie, he did watch Samsung games, and he wanted them to be kind of like one of these legendary support jungle duos. But you were telling me something interesting before we started. Actually, it was Samsung Blue that you were more inspired by, right?
Yeah, because I think Samsung White, when they showed the dominance they had in Worlds 2014, because they lost maps, right, against TSM and in the final, but League of Legends wasn't as advanced as it is now. But the knowledge advantage they had wasn't, let's say, stable enough, right? Like they were just, the matches they won, they steamrolled. That's basically what I meant. If they lost the map, that doesn't mean they weren't dominant, right? Because we could go to SKT without losing maps, for example, in OGN, right? But the whole idea was that I think that Samsung Blue were the first team to actually innovate lane control and the subsequent vision control to go with that in the right tempo and the right people, which in this case is the jungle and support role. And I think that Samsung Blue had worse players, but Samsung White, it took a long time, half a year for them to learn this. And that's why they lost against Samsung Blue in, I think, LoL Masters, OGN, Spring, and Summer, if I remember correctly. 3-1, I think they lost. And then they steamrolled them 3-0 in Worlds. Because before Worlds is the moment they were able to say, okay, now we get it. Now we got it down. Now we have changed the thinking of players like Mata and Dan, because these players have been playing for a long time, especially Mata, right? It's not easy to form a player that's been playing for a long time. So that took a lot of time. And I assume it's because them being sister teams and being in a team house had an effect on that, right? I think Samsung Blue were the innovators, but they weren't able to make it into something nice, right?
Yeah, I'll actually corroborate. That actually is famously the reason why Monty picked Samsung White to actually be the one that won Worlds, even though Blue had been the one that was in all the finals. And at the time, the KT Arrows upset was like a shock. Everyone thought they were going to win 2 championships and be like the best Korean team ever. So his theory was basically that if it's early in a patch change or a meta change, he would want the Samsung Blue team. Like, they looked like, as you say, like they were the head of the curve. But then because it was not only their sister team who was scrimming them all the time, but the other team had like the star players. Like, that's one of the most skill-stacked lineups ever, Samsung White. His logic was that if you're at the end of a patch cycle, which actually I think that Worlds was, I don't think they made any radical changes going in, that like basically the superior players, it's like you've almost taught them how to play the game at the level you're talking at, but then they're better players as well. So what do you think on this, Kelsey?
Yeah, I mean, I think more importantly, Worlds is always really, really interesting to study because it's probably the longest period where we get to see competitive on a patch that doesn't change, because it'll be the same as like when the same patch for the qualifying patch into like the very end, right? Even in the 2015, which was probably the biggest failure of patching in the history of League of Legends World Championship, it was the same patch at the start of the Worlds tournament, and then at the end, you can always see changes to the game that happen over time, and picks that people start to like mess around with, or counters that they develop just based on the fact that they get to play on the same patch forever. So this is like always why I wish that Riot would actually patch less, because I think you get to see way more interesting innovations. And like 2-week patching cycle is like you don't run out of material in 2 weeks. No way.
No.
In a month you can't either, I think.
Basically, I know here also during Worlds, all the teams from all the regions are going to be playing against each other. So even Samsung White can possibly learn something from NALCS and TSM. I know you're mad, Thorin, but no, like seriously, right? Maybe not a lot, but for example, 1 or 2 picks, right? Like this also forces teams to innovate. So I agree with the statement that during Worlds and at the end of Worlds is probably the most effective and fast games and clean games you can get, because this is going to be the pinnacle of League of Legends and is going to be the best minds of League of Legends working on the current state of the game and the patch.
Yeah, I would also say, like, I mean, people have probably heard me do this rant before, but because I come from games, like, my favourite games actually are the ones Quake, StarCraft, CS.
StarCraft.
These are the games that, like, except for StarCraft 2, like, StarCraft 1, they didn't get patched for literally, like, 10 years. So the thing with those games is they're basically static metas. And I can tell you in those games, because they're very good games as well, it never gets stale. Like this is the key concept that people have missed with patching, is that because you know it's going to be patched, people aren't taking this into account. Part of why people complain so much is to motivate Riot to do a patch change. It's not always that what they're complaining about in the patch is as bad as they think. Coupled with when you play in solo queue and something's broken, it's even more broken than it might be against certain teams, etc. Hence why some things have win rates that are terrible in pro play, but then are broken as fuck, like every version of Rise that's playable, basically. So the problem with this, right, is people, if something's really broken for 3 weeks or a month, people go, right, because there is a period where you'll plateau, like everyone's doing that one thing, no one's found a counter yet. People then will say, right, it's stale, but then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, right, it's stale, it's all you can do, there's no point even trying. But actually, it's almost like that old cliched saying, like, you know, it's darkest before the dawn strikes or whatever. The moment that it seems like it's plateaued is actually when someone is probably, if you don't change the patch, on the brink of bringing out a counter that will not just like beat that, will be the new thing that's OP as fuck, which is nearly what always happens unless you're just playing some really terrible limited game, you know. As far as I know, that does happen a lot. So I understand the way the league is. You're never going to be like CS and just leave it unpatched for years and years and years. But let it breathe a bit more. Like, I always thought the best approach I heard people say was to have something along the lines of like seasons of the year. You know, you'd have like 3 or 4 months where you'd have a certain patch that we'd play. And the whole point is, once people learned that it's going to be like this for the next 3 months, you also wouldn't overreact in the first month. You wouldn't just go so ham on the idea that, like, oh, it's unfair. You'd know, right, we've got to ease into this. Well, in fact, maybe this isn't broken. Maybe I don't know how to play this version of the game yet. I think that would actually be more healthy for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it, in a way, like, frequent patching makes it more stale, right? Because people will just only have a limited bandwidth to learn certain champs, right? So, like, they'll just ban the most OP shit that gets released because they don't have like the time or the bandwidth to deal with it or to work with it before the next patch change comes or whatever else. So they'll just play static scrims with that champion banned, and then it'll be banned on stage. Whereas if you let it breathe a bit more, people might be more willing to say, okay, like, we have some time to sort of figure out counters to work on this type of champion like over time. So it's a little weird.
Actually, also it becomes a blur for the pro players. Like, if you ask a pro player now, what was the exact meta during the second week? I don't know, 2 months ago. Like 2 months ago, right?
Yeah.
I remember times when the meta was quite still and people weren't creative enough and things weren't fast enough, and they would be able to say, "Oh yeah, not much change." Like, since 2 months, the biggest thing that has changed is probably that now it's not easy to invade the second blue buff because people have thought about that and they weren't. Like, you could ask that because the game was much simpler back then, and they would be able to say that. But nowadays, if you ask a pro player 2 months ago what was the strongest compared to now, they're like, "Oh man, everything has changed."
Sure.
Right? Like, we play a completely different champion pool because of this and this. Right? Because the patches are so fast, it just becomes a blur.
And then the other thing is, like, as a certain AD carry that we don't talk about anymore used to always say as an excuse, it's like, they'll just patch the champion, so I don't need to learn it. It's like, I don't want people to be able to use that excuse either. Like, I'll just wait a month. It's like, no, learn that shit if you're actually going to be good. If you can't learn it, by the way, as that certain AD carry would, just fucking admit it. Stop pretending it's just because it's going to be patched later. That's not why you're not playing it. Anyway, whatever. We won't make this thing there. Right, so let's get into this topic then.
Yep.
Kelsey, give me your version of it, because here's the thing, right? One of the problems, and this is the reason why when I wrote that article, like, I had to go ham digging back into all the old articles you'd done and find them all, because the one problem with your career is the problem that basically is the problem with esports journalism, is that it's just so much day-to-day content that it has to be about this week's match, next week's match, an interview with a player, like, and so the problem with that is you used to basically do the kind of articles I like the historical ones or address some big topic, but you had to basically just like put that in, and then it was just like sprinkled into these day-to-day pieces that just get lost in the mix of time. So I don't think I've ever actually seen you write an article just about this topic, right? You've definitely addressed it in many other articles, but have you ever written one just about this?
So I think I did write something at the end of, it was actually for On Gamers. It was at the end of the World Championship where I talked about what Mata and Dandy were doing. But in terms of just to touch on the Samsung Blue versus Samsung White topic, I remember we did the show with Monty, which was like the argument of kind of which one was better.
Yes.
If I recall correctly. And I like, part of the reason I was on the Samsung Blue side is because I did kind of agree with Veggie on this topic. It's just like they often were ahead of X, Y, and Z, and a lot of the foundations that they got were created in place before Samsung White like developed theirs, which a lot of stuff Samsung White themselves developed individually, I felt like was catered towards countering what Samsung Blue did, right? So like a lot of their developments were basically just like, how do we beat our sister team? Which was like interesting in itself, but that's also what makes Samsung Blue kind of the catalyst of a lot of these ideas. I would say that one of the biggest things that Samsung White did was like in terms of vision defense was really, really, really strong. Like this was a lot of times when they kind of, I feel like Mata, when he goes on teams, like his philosophy of vision didn't really develop after this time, just because they would put down wards and they would overstay their tempo to kind of like defend them, right? Rather than refreshing them. So like these types of ideas, I think made them a little bit unique in like the vision system compared to Samsung Blue. This was like also a really easy year to innovate, right? Because this was when the vision system completely changed from the season 3. Okay,
you didn't have unlimited wards basically anymore.
Yeah, into season 4, like we have the Sidestone support's going to be able to have support and jungler basically facilitating all of the vision on the map by themselves, but they also have like items and they have like strength and the ability to kind of skirmish and defend. So those types of ideas were bound to kind of be laid out or discovered by someone. It just so happened to be Samsung Blue, and Samsung White had like the players that where they could think of wards as objectives that they could defend themselves, right? So I think
maybe I'll go on a small tangent here about Samsung Blue. One thing I remember very clearly, because why I'm in general going to talk about Samsung Blue as a, let's say, inspiration for the ROCCAT that was then, was because when we were watching Korea back then, that's when Samsung Blue was actually better, right? Because once our season finished in ROCCAT, and that was 2014, then World started, and that's when Samsung White started being good. So it's a very basic concept, right? I'm an engineer, right? So my approach is this. Okay, so we have a system of players, right? My idea was that if we have a system of interchanging parts where every part is doing his job, well, then together it works as a system and boom, it works. So my approach with the ROCCAT players was to have each player have a specific amount of jobs that he does. And if he does this for a week, then after a week, he'll become an expert in this in this job. And the other players will obviously have faith in him then. And then that's why we had different shot callers in different parts of the game. And of course, the game was much easier back then. That's always what we have to remember. Like nowadays, I think that probably Mad Lions would win Worlds in 2014. I'm pretty sure, you know. But basically, though, like one thing I clearly remember is that in the summer season, right? Because I had school, so I came to the ROCCAT House only like week 4, and we were 1-7. We were last in the league. And I sat down with Vander, and I'm like, look, because I finished my studies, so the last 3 days I was looking at Samsung Blue a lot, right? And that was the days when there was swaps gazillion. Everybody was swapping. But the thing is, in Europe, the swaps were just generally dumbed down to, we don't want to play this matchup, so let's just swap it, right?
Yes, sure.
And then I remember I saw Samsung pulling the wave level 1, Samsung Blue, during a match. So sometimes they pulled the wave, sometimes they didn't. Now, the thing with Korean teams is that because of their mentality, they played in a very planned way. That's why maybe they're not the best teams now, but at least you always can predict easily and reverse engineer what they're doing.
Yes.
So I watched 5 matches in a row, and obviously pausing every 5 seconds. This was in general my style. Maybe one VOD review would take 2 hours for me. That's how I work for myself for my analysis, right? And I saw that they would pull the wave dependent on the jungle starts, right? So my idea was that I had to dumb this down for my players. My players are not, Vander's not going to go in a game and think, okay, so the jungle's starting here, so we have to pull it. So I just gave them 2 branches, right? Two logical branches. Okay, if we want to dive fast on bot lane, don't pull the wave. If you want to dive slower and Jankos has a longer route, then pull the wave and stack the wave a little bit longer, and then you have a bigger wave to dive with. And this desynchronizes the enemy jungler. This was the first time I'm like, these Samsung Blue guys are geniuses. Because nobody was doing this. It seems so simple nowadays, right? But back then, nobody was thinking to do a slow push or a fast push based on jungle start. And that was the moment I'm like, okay, I got to watch these guys later. So that was, I think, one of the first innovations was that during the swaps, because we're talking about vision and jungle support duos, but this is actually one of the first innovations. They actually redefined the swaps that were invented by Europe by playing around the correct quickness of waves gathering under towers, right?
This must be music.
Which is the base of the game nowadays. Nowadays, everything's about waves. Back then, it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, this was like for sure. This was like teams like WE and Samsung Blue that didn't have like the strongest individual skill in the early game were able to stall out just because they understood waves better, right? So you could see like the Team WE games where they were able to kind of manipulate the waves in the mid game and the late game to stall out, compared to like Samsung Blue, which I felt like they were one of the only teams that kind of understood waves early and could actually build up wave advantages so they couldn't get dove, or so that they could control like and get themselves a favorable advantage in the lane.
There's also one detail you didn't mention, which is key here, which is one of the best. This is like, okay, one of my things I love in like life philosophy is that people don't realize that it's not a cliche. Like failure is literally the best teacher for success because it tells you what you're doing wrong if you listen. So as a result, right, if I was to talk about this, one of the things I would reference here is, well, why would Samsung Blue, compared to other teams, want to make it so that early on they couldn't get dove in lane swap? Because they're AD carry, if people don't know. Now, he's obviously still one of the top players, Deft. Now he's a monster in every area of the game. He's become a complete player. But back then, he really was like the ridiculous AD carry where it's like, right, if we don't babysit this motherfucker for the first like 10, 15 minutes, he's going to die so many times and the game will be over. But if we can babysit him and get him to that team fight, he's just going to carry the whole game. So like, it even makes sense that there would be a necessity in their mind that they'd be looking for something like this, I would imagine.
Yeah, especially since this gave an advantage in early game because they didn't have to play 2 versus 2. I remember Samsung Blue also innovated the level 1. So they would invade having a worse level 1 team comp just to put a ward behind the wall and run away. Even if they burned a flash, they did that. There were some games I remember from LoL Masters. There was a tournament like this back in the day. And I remember that was, I think, right before our playoff round. And I'm like, hey, look, guys, like they're losing a flash. In a matchup, they don't need the flash for. I'm not saying it's 100% planned. Like, we can't expect that to be planned. I'm going to burn flash the ward, right? But I could see the way they were thinking that, because obviously the innovation went further. Okay, so if they can't predict our jungle route, they won't know if they should fast or slow push it, right?
Yes.
So then the idea was, okay, let's find out where the jungle starts, right? So they were also one of the first teams to think about that. And, it was genius back then, right? I honestly think that nowadays, like Deft, as you said, is a genius, right? But back then, I remember that he was problematic in the early game, and I would be quite sure that Imp and Mata would destroy them 2 versus 2.
Sure.
And this was good.
Nowadays, destroying on lane doesn't happen. Nobody wins 1 versus 1, 2 versus 2, right? But back then, that happened, right? We're talking about Forgiven era, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it. Like one thing I noticed about Deft and Heart is I felt like there were a lot of concepts like when I watched them that Deft didn't understand, but Heart did. So like you would see the wave would get set up early and then Heart would end up roaming basically for vision or to just like go affect mid lane, anything like that. And then Deft would just like walk ahead of the wave and try to like trade, right? So it felt like there were a lot of these concepts that he just like didn't understand and he was kind of micromanaged and along for the ride. So Deft was like really strange within the context of that team.
Right, if we go then to some of the vision aspects then, right? So I'll just give you like the super layman's version that I always remember. Isn't it something along the lines of, right, since, as you say, quite crucially, the vision had changed because season 3, when you had the likes of SK Telecom, well, the reason why the fucking eternal phrase pick comp, which is now like a cursed term, used to be so used is because if you were ahead and you had vision all over the map, so you just have vision on the entire map, then yeah, you can just go anywhere on the map as like a gang and just wreck anyone who walks in that area with their blind walking in the fog of war. The problem is when you came to season 4, well, listen, it wasn't the same as trinkets, I guess, as we've mentioned here. It's the sight stones instead. So now instead, it's like it's more limited who has the wards, but it's still the supportive jungle element that's doing the warding, right? Wasn't the innovation something along the lines of this? most teams basically just did a worse / more limited version of what they did in Season 3. They try to generally ward the whole map and then just hope that they do it in the right timing, that they can get enough vision. But obviously that will create massive black spots, even on the team winning. Whereas as far as I remember, wasn't it something like the Samsung teams figured out, just pick one half of the map, ward that up basically with all your wards, and you can get pretty good coverage at that point in time, at which point then if someone comes into your jungle, you've probably got all mapped out where they are, and if you're the Samsung White players, you can actually just go and find a 6 skirmish that they don't even think is going to happen, and you just get kills off it. You can get kills all over the map. Am I off on that?
I can take this. Because I'm gonna be honest. Layman terms are most of the times the best things because it's KISS. Keep it simple, stupid, right?
Yes.
So the idea here, one thing I would change is it's not about half the map. The thing I realized was playing 3/4 because they played to win, right? Samsung White played to win. So their idea was we can ward half the map in an equal game. In an equal game, in theory, let's say we ward half and they ward half.
Okay.
But if we want to win, then we have to ward and control more of the map than the opponent. So I think their way of thinking was this: always aggressively ward one side of the map, and this is what you're saying, right? So you're still warding 2 quadrants, right?
Yeah.
Which is possible in the new vision system. But one quadrant is aggressively moved forward, and that's the jungle you invade with the jungle and do vision. And your quadrant is the defensive one, and that's where the top wards and the mid lane are ward. So if you control 3/4 and you expect the enemy players, they can't just run through mid diagonally into your quadrant where you have no vision, then you're controlling 3/4 of the map. And this was revolutionary. This changed everything because Samsung took it further. Okay, but we don't mindlessly ward aggressively the quadrant and defensively the quadrant. We have to know which side of the map we want to play around. So each reset, we have to think about the objective. We have to think about the wave state. We have to think about which lanes are ahead. And that's why they were so good, because I think Samsung Blue came up with the 3/4, right? But they didn't know how to do it. They didn't have the players who could say like, oh, listen up, Acorn, are you winning top now or not? He's like, yeah, I'm winning. And then he dies 1 versus 1, right? I think Samsung White were better 1 versus 1 players, and they were able to possibly predict or just outplay their opponents. And that's why they were able to correctly assume that this is going to be the strong side, this is going to be the weak side, and ward accordingly.
I think also one thing to notice is that they were very... Like, one thing that I observed watching the final against ROCCAT, right? Which a lot of those games, like half of those games are very Fiesta, but the ones like the first game and then the closing game were the ones that had a lot more method to them. One thing that was interesting about Samsung White is that they were kind of conscious about which wards they were okay with, like, when talking about defensive wards, which wards they were okay with giving up, right? Which wards they were okay with having cleared, because they're just getting the information from the clear, and then which wards they wanted to defend, right? So that was like the big difference, is that we're going to put like our high value wards, like maybe our pinks or whatever, and we're going to stand on them and we're going to fight over them. But if people like steal the green wards on the other side, or we'll just make a play on our strong vision, and we'll use that as information and not care if those wards get cleared, right? So they were very kind of selective about which wards they would defend, and they definitely, like, based on watching their map movements, it was clear that they had that separation, whereas I think a lot of other teams didn't, right? A lot of other teams probably didn't even think of vision as something that you defend, right? Yeah. As something that you hold, or as a resource or an objective.
It's basically treating the pinks that you're talking about as mini objectives, right? So this was the change in mindset, right? An objective is not just a Drake and Baron, because that's what all teams were doing, right? Or a tower, let's say. But an objective is a place in the map. And if we have a pink there, then that's an objective we have an advantage on. And that's what they played around. So yeah, I agree with that also, right? And most teams, I think, were like 2 months behind in knowledge, and this changed immensely once all of Korea caught up. Because after the first, let's say, half of the year, during Worlds, Samsung had the best players, but before Worlds, all Korean teams just copied everything. And this is the same thing we were doing in ROCCAT, right? So it just shows how this was an inspiration for the whole world, basically, right? Everybody was watching Korea back then. And I remember that I had a bit of a Korea mania back then, because, those were the days of I think there was like, even before I went to the ROCCAT house in the summer, right? Like 2 days before, a Korean document came out about StarCraft houses, right? I think it was with the LGIM team or something. Yeah. So Incredible Miracle, right? That was StarTale before, if I remember correctly, right? or something.
I'm not sure. I don't think so, but yeah.
Okay, maybe they were in the same document, right? But basically, I remember I went also to the ROCCAT house, and I was telling them that, look at these guys. These guys are geniuses. They sit down and they play the game all the time, and they have coaches and they have structure and everything. And this is why this was a bit of a manipulation. And this is why you have to listen to me and do what this team is doing and copy it.
Okay,
Copy it. This was my approach. There was a lot of misinformation back then. Back then in Europe, we thought they had 50 analysts. Well, okay, not 50, but actually it's not true, right? This was mostly the players innovating from the information we have now, right? The coaches were helping were managers maybe, right? But we thought they have like 10 analysts, man.
Yes.
And I'm like, let them do the grunt work and we try to copy this, right? Because it's just me from the coaching staff in ROCCAT. And that's why I would watch a lot of VODs, and especially with Vander, as I was saying before. I remember when we sat down and we did a 3-hour, just the two of us, 3-hour review of, look, they're pulling the wave now, and now they're not pulling the wave. And go into a custom and do it. And that, for example, changed the middle of our season. Just that one thing. It's so funny that back then, just one small thing like that could change the outcome of your matches for the next week or the next 2 weeks.
Sure. Well, okay. What about this? Listen, again, we're trying to remember stuff from 6 years ago, so I don't expect people to necessarily know it in depth. But we'll see what you can give me on this. In contrast, how would other teams back in that same era have played? Because this is one of the things, obviously. Like, if you knew, basically, if someone told you that this is what they were doing now, I'm sure even some of the Korean teams would have beaten Samsung Blue. But because they didn't know, actually, they didn't know how. Basically, as you're saying, it kind of like streamlines how you're going to play the game. You've already decided which quadrants you're going to play around, what lanes you're going to play around, when you need to protect the lane, when you can leave it open. Like, if you knew these things, it's like having a free scouting report. But if you don't know it, you're actually not going to be able to seize upon it at all. So how did other teams play at the time, do you think?
Okay, so remember this is what you said now is very important. This is the peak of in-house 2-team style of Korea.
Yes.
Right? So nowadays, this is it's impossible for a team to have a head-long advantage for other teams, right? Like G2 winning Europe, it's just genius players, right? But the fact is, right, they didn't win by macro, right? Back then, if you had an inside meta created like Samsung White and Samsung Blue, you had a real advantage. I don't know. I don't have the information. How often did Samsung White or Samsung Blue actually scrim other teams in Korea? But that's why I think they were above the competition, right? So the other teams, I'm going to be honest, I don't think they did shit, because back then in LCS, I was a coach. RNA was a coach I respected. He liked to dumb down the game even more than me, but it was aggressive, right? It was really straightforward and it worked, right? But apart from that, you had Jensen, which was back then Veggie, right? He had a ban, but basically he was a sub in SK, and there was Leduk and Copenhagen Wolves, whose main job was to make scrambled eggs. There was no coaching scene back then.
Yeah, sure.
So that's why it was easy. It was easy in ROCCAT to be ahead in macro. I remember we would have weeks where we would win and we're like, oh my gosh, we're ahead in macro. It's just, we're so bad, but we win because these teams, they pushed the wave. Like, we would watch our reviews after one game. Obviously, everybody was hyped up and happy, right? So we would watch games and VODs, and we'd be from the day, and we'd be like, oh my gosh, these guys, they're so behind. Like, we went through over 3 weeks ago. Look at the mistake they made here. Nowadays, I think that's non-existent. Nowadays, that happens in between matches during scrims where there's a macro problem and you quickly solve it, right? But in those days, I think, I don't know about the other coaches, but I know definitely that, like, maybe me and maybe RNA, we actually were able to see what the Koreans are doing, right? And in Korea, I think there was, maybe a different approach, maybe a different cultural approach, where it was like, okay, these guys are screaming in-house, don't touch them. Like, I'm not sure how the information flow went there. I was just doing reverse engineering, so my work was really, like, non-efficient, right? You have to watch, like, 5 matches, pausing every 5 seconds and writing down a piece of paper what's going on and looking at the mini map, right? Like, I wouldn't look at the stupid team fight. I'd be looking at the mini map, right?
Yes.
And that was a lot of work, right? So I wasn't able to do everything, right? Like, you have, let's say, 12 hours a day as a pro gamer back then, right? So maybe we'd have scrims. Maybe I'd play one solo queue just for the heck of it, to think I was a pro player back then. I'd read Reddit for an hour, and then probably with Thorin in the background, and then I'd have 3 hours of VOD work, right? So it wasn't like I was able to do an extreme amount of work. But I think macro-wise, other teams depended on their players. doing the work and watching Koreans.
Yep. I mean, that's like a really big distinction that Soaz makes, right? Is that like it took him a really long time to feel like he could trust his coach to do that work because he would always just do it himself, right? So I think that there's definitely a lot of that going on. I think as a coach, like the best thing you can do is to take on as much of that work yourself and then just allow them to play as much as possible in solo queue or whatever. And then find ways to efficiently deliver the information to them so that they understand it. Because obviously you can't tell them what to do in game. And then but I think that there was no setup for a system like that. And when other coaches were kind of forced on LCS teams, like they were definitely not even doing that. They were, like you said, maybe they were doing cooking or they were doing other
Something
stuff.
that you just reminded me now. Other teams analyzed, like an analyst position back then, or even a coach position. A coach actually analyzed the opponents. So I always thought that was a waste of time. Like if I'm playing the finals or I'm playing in the playoff bracket, I will analyze the opponent. So I'll look at their level ones. Picks and bans is basic. Picks and bans is not analytical work. You have to do this. Is like you have to know what the opponent is. So obviously I did picks and bans, but I actually and I remember I think actually Ledok was one of the guys who back then he was like creating spreadsheets for his players where, this guy didn't ward here at 130, and I thought back then, what a waste of time. You could have had made your team better, which is more important during the season when you're playing 7 other teams than focusing on the opponent that you're playing the next day, right? And that's why I generally did picks and bans, and maybe I looked at level 1s, but nothing apart from that. I didn't like say stuff like, okay, I think these guys, look at minute 10, they're always lost on the second buff, right? I would do that before a playoffs run, and because those things change from week to week. But back then, the approach was that actually analyst work is like trying to look for statistical dependencies in the opponent. That was a waste of time back then because you couldn't use that anyways, right? We had a analyst in ROCCAT before I joined, like the first week. Actually, I got a proposition to join, like it was KMT back then, but they were in H2K actually back then. I don't know if people know this. A lot of people don't remember this. Actually, Jankos and Vander were twice in H2K. So when they were in H2K, they won against me in the Polish LAN, and that's when they approached me because I wanted to quit playing. And they approached me to coach them before relegations as KMT. And the first week there were analysts there, and this guy, I'm like, okay, let's see what an analyst is supposed to do. So he sends me a spreadsheet, and this became a meme in the ROCCAT house. 2 things. So first there was analysis of a scrim block of ROCCAT, and there was like a timer, 500. Vander bad flash, then 700 over pound nice TP, thumbs up. I'm like, what is going? I sacked him the same day, even though he wasn't even paid back then. But I'm like, this is useless. Like, how are we going to in game use? What is coaching? Okay, you flash good, you flash bad. Yeah, everything's great, right? That was the level of coaching back then because nobody knew what to do, right? So I focused on how to improve my team, and that's what I did while looking at the Korean guys because they were the easiest to emulate because you knew everything that they're trying to do is probably planned out.
Yeah, I mean this is even now, right? Part of the reason why a lot of coaching staff still look at LCK over LPL is that it's like, yeah, you can take away from an LPL match that a lot of the stuff they're doing is planned, right? You get the idea that they're like taking this reset and then they're going to go to Baron at this timing, but a lot of it is also just like super situational, and then they end up just like, seeing someone out of position and they kill him and the plan completely changes after that anyway. But just like a lot of the stuff, like for example, the way Effort wards when they're playing a poke comp is different from the way he wards when they're playing like a dive comp. So you can look at that, and that's something that you can break down for your support player and show him examples. Whereas if you're looking at an LPL match, that's like a lot more nuanced and a lot stranger to kind of look at because it changes game to game too much.
And actually, what you're talking about now is LPL is just great at intuition. I mean, their players are based on intuition. And talking about the ROCCAT lineup, actually, Jankos was one of the players I changed the least because his intuition was so good. I didn't want to touch it. The only really macro thing I changed in Jankos was during the spring split when he had like a 2-week window. He had a big problem in the mid game, like because Jankos was the king of first bloods. He'd do first bloods. I didn't tell him how to gank. right? I worked with Vander and with Zazas a lot on macro. Those were the two guys that I could improve a lot with macro, right? But Jankos was this guy who was just great intuition. Nowadays, he's definitely a different player, right?
Sure.
But back then, he was a player that I didn't want to program per se, right? I wanted him to play kind of his style. And the only time, so early game was his responsibility, right? In general, apart from the pulling of waves and swaps, that was Vander's responsibility. But Jankos actually, in general, played around intuition. And that's actually better, right? As we see now, the Chinese teams, they're better, right? Like we just saw what happened today, right? We have a Chinese final, right? And it's just because aggression and all-out intuition is just better because you're not thinking about what to do. You're doing it, right? You're killing the opponent.
Sure. Yeah. Reminds me of, there's like a great saying, I heard it was repeated in that last dance documentary, where when the classic Pistons coach in the NBA, Chuck Daly, was coaching Dennis Rodman, and he initially got him and was like, he was a very wild player and obviously had his own style of player. He just said to the assistant coaches, just leave him and do what you want. You don't put a saddle on a Mustang. That's like the philosophy. Yeah, here's the difference. To use the classic example, if like a TSM had taken Jankos, they would have just taken him and said, "Yo, you don't do that. Like, what are you doing here? Like, why did you do that?" You'd drive all the genius out of the player. You'd get a player that might be what you think you want, but actually that in itself could be the curse, right? Because when you got a player who's got, like, listen, if you have feel for the game, natural feel for the game, that's worth its weight in gold. That's so rare.
Yeah. So this is why I think Samson White was so good. Not only could you program them, but I think Dandy's and Mata thinking, as you said before, Kelsey, he hasn't changed till today, Mata. That's his natural play style that was unlocked in him, that it's the jungle support, catching by hands, and let's go together for adventure. And it just worked for them. It was natural, and that's why they were so good at it.
And it's not just Mata, right? Like, you can feel the imprint of when if you look at his teams, like if you look at Royal Club now, like most of those players that are still on that lineup played with Mata, right? So like Xiaohu and UZI still did. They will still do a lot of the things that they started to develop when he was playing with them, right? So I think that you can see like that kind of imprint on a lot of his teams. So he also has like a very commanding kind of leadership presence that he can like also kind of program the other players. Like he'll go into custom games and he'll show them things. So that's just like also his personality as being a coach player. So
would you, and listen, I don't want to go too deep on this particular point, as in it might be a reach, but would you also say that these were players in terms of Dandy and Mata? It seemed to me like they were the ultimate example of like the alpha players at those positions, where they were like, Dandy wasn't the slave of any laner, and obviously Mata literally directed the entire team. Like, these were the guys who tell their lane, like, you come with me now, and we're going to go and do this. And this, like, that in itself's pretty revolutionary. I mean, remember, it was not that many seasons before that the support was a ward bot, and the jungler was a guy who just played fucking tanks, who you just tell to come to your lane.
And ganked. Like, honestly, before the Samson White revolution in macro, a jungler did ganks. Like, as I told you before, Jankos did ganks. I'm like, yeah, like, I can tell him to do something, but I know he's a genius, so just let him do his ganks in the early game. And Vander, like, minute 10, when the first tower goes down, the mid down sides, that's when you can start telling Jankos what to do, right? But just leave him be, right? But Samson changed it the other way around. There's no such thing as ganks. It's putting on pressure with the correct wave and with numbers advantage and vision advantage. There's nothing like ganking, right? And I think that, of course, you know, that's simplified. Obviously, Dandy still did ganks, but that's because the opponents didn't know what was going on. And, you know, if it's a free kill, you go for it, right? But you could see that the game plan wasn't, Dandy, just do your ganks. Because that's how it was in Europe, honestly. It was, Dandy, you know, if you have an option, then do it. But that's not your game plan. Your game plan is to do your jungle. Tell Mata, okay, I'm finishing my jungle in 20 seconds. I'm finishing the top side. Let's reset and let's go to Drake. And Mata then probably took, this is what I was thinking, right? He probably took over control, and on the reset, he's like, okay, everybody now, please reset. This is your moment to reset. In 30 seconds, there's no more resets. We are resetting. You are all buying wards, and we are going toward here and here as two people, right? And I think it was just a controlled manner of shot calling after resets, right? Where this obviously worked always in the late game. Like, people knew how to do this around Baron and Drake, but nobody thought about doing this from minute 0.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's because I was just looking to try to find the VOD for the example, but just the idea of their play being coordinated, like Dandy and Mata, outside of just like them meeting up together, right? and them using pressure as a concept.
From the finals against Royal Club, I think in the first map, because I was like watching it, I think today, just to remember some things. I think in the first map there was a swap, and on the first reset of Dandy, like Dandy and Matter, they just reset at the same time. Once the top column is finished, and they just go to the blue side bottom jungle, so that's where the red is, and they just ward everything, and they play and they swap and they play around bot because that's their strong side now. It's just it's so simple nowadays, right? When you look at it, but it was so effective back then because Royal, they didn't know what to do, and you can see who was the Insect was in jungle, and he was. By the time he resetted, he went with his dual lane straight to bot lane tower. He couldn't even enter his jungle because he knew the opponents was there, but he didn't know how to react to that. The mistake he made was that 10 seconds ago, he didn't call his own support to do the same thing, right? So that just shows that he didn't know what to do to fix the problems.
Yep. And the example I was looking at just now was from the semifinals, Samsung White, Samsung Blue, because I was trying to remember like exactly what I would say would be the difference in Samsung White's innovations toward the end that separated them from Samsung Blue. Like there's a moment like 20 minutes in where Samsung Blue sees like Mata go in on top side to ward, right? And because they're behind, they want to avoid that area, so they assume that that's like the strong side, right? And then they move over into the bot side river, like near Dragon, to try to get their own control. But Dandy's like waiting in there with Imp, and then they're waiting to collapse on them, like off of the play that Mata, like by himself, kind of baited.
So
them
that's like a mind game, right? That's a fake.
Things where it's like, again, like I think the big difference between what Samsung Blue had originally and what Samsung White came out with was like this concept of like expending weak side wards as a resource and then just like defending your own vision, which was much stronger, I think.
Right, because they thought the response was you can go and do this there, but actually
the response is just do the same thing, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Do the same
but
thing.
But if the opponent feels the game state better and they're already there on their own pinks, they win. This was also something that Samsung Blue innovated, was how to play from when you're really behind. So I remember I don't remember the exact game, but I remember Samsung Blue was from red side because this is a game I watched with the ROCCAT team. And because we were losing back then, as I said, it was a hard moment. And I'm like, what do we do when we're behind? Because, you know, the obvious response is, it's a scrim FF. Sure. I got so pissed at that because I'm like, look, we're 1-7. Why do you expect to win early game? You have to play at the scrim. And they're like, but you can't do anything. And I'm like, okay, let's focus on that problem. And I remember it took like 2 days, but I found a solution, and it was Samsung Blue again. I saw that they got invaded that game and they lost. Like they had the enemy jungler had a triple buff start. And on the second route, even though the jungler, Spirit had no money, right? Because he got invaded, he was screwed. He still bought a pink ward, and the support bought a pink ward. And it was so simple. They just moved the line of vision from the river into their jungle. And in Polish, I called that punkty newralgiczne. Like, in general, it's a funny name just so the players can remember, right? I had a lot of names, like those Heroes 3 of Might and Magic, to remember the players. That was like a command that I think Zazas had the command that remember to say Heroes of 3 of Might and Magic in the game. That meant that, oh, guys, remember this is a turn-based game and it's their turn now. It was stuff like that. So punkty newralgiczne was something like this. That meant that if we're behind, ward defensive in the jungle, and once they go for the wards, that's when you fight for that. You can give away the ward, but if you get them to half HP when you're behind and you didn't lose HP because they're the one face checking, that's a win for you, right? Maybe on your next cooldown rotation, you can actually finish them off. So this was actually very important also that we saw Samsung Blue, even on the second route, like getting an even bigger debt for their jungler because he didn't buy items. He bought a pink, which is not like a battle item, right?
Sure.
He took an even bigger debt to get back into the game.
By the way, that's one of the reasons, by the way. You know what? I'll give credit to Riot. One thing I think they actually did that was good in League of Legends was add that principle that obviously now all the like stat sites track of like vision score, which listen, just means how many fucking wards you play. So it doesn't actually tell you anything qualitatively. But the reason it's good is because anyone who's not a pro, you cannot convince them to buy fucking wards because to them, they don't know what they're doing with them. So it is wasted money to them. Just telling them to basically place loads of them, just by accident, they'll place some that end up working. So it actually does work as an incentive because listen, when you say that, any coach is like, fucking Spirit, what a man, buying a fucking pink ward when he's got no jungle items back. That's what a legend. Because trying to tell a jungler who's behind to do that early on is like, fucking hell, you'd have to be an amazing leader to convince him of that.
Yeah, it was really hard to change the player's mentality. Like I had to tell Yankos, you're behind, you're still gonna buy a pink. And it's always like this. And they say no, and you have to be as a coach ready, right? When the discussion with the player comes, you have to have things, you have
the rebuttals for when they say no. Exactly.
Look at this, right?
I remember having a conversation with a player that was along the lines of, it's like, so why didn't you buy pink there? He says, well, I didn't farm well enough to afford one.
Yeah, well, that happens, right? Like sometimes there's situations where you just have 30, there's a buy. Like nowadays, things have really changed, and vision and actually buying pinks has become really fluid. I've been in teams in the past years where actually, because when I give a player, a job to do, I call it a quest, like from RPGs, right? Like it's easy to imagine, the players are stupid. You have to help them, right? I'm not that aggressive, but it helps the player, right? That, look, you do this quest and you get EXP and you get a higher level. You'll be better in 2 weeks, okay? Just start doing this, right? So honestly, there have been very good players where they had a quest of, you leave base, buy the pink. This has to become muscle memory because they would forget. Overpaw was one of these players, actually, right? Where I had to really jam into his head and watch some Korean League of Legends and watch like Pawn, Dade, and Faker. I'm like, look, he left base, he has the pink. And Overpaw would have like 150 gold and he wouldn't buy the pinks. He'd just forget, right? So back then, there were really, really basic problems.
I mean, one of the areas about that I always found very weird as well is like, this is something where actually Counter-Strike was way ahead of League of Legends, because in Counter-Strike for many, many years, people have understood the principle that like, just because you can buy the gun that you need, which is like basically a rifle, you don't just buy the armor and the rifle, because in the modern day Counter-Strike, the utility, the flashbangs, the smokes is so crucial, not only to if you're on the offensive side, but if you're the defensive side, you have no counter utility. You can't throw it to flash the guy who come in, slow him down. So what people learned years ago in Counter-Strike was, if you can only buy the gun and none of the utility, you buy a worse gun to get the utility, because the concept is that will actually win you the round more than just like, because you're making the gunfight easier for yourself.
You can't use a better gun, right?
Yeah.
Just like in the League of Legends example, if you don't see the opponent, who cares if you have the long
Exactly.
sword?
Yeah, the logic would be like this. Even if you're behind, the way you'd convince the guy he needs the pink is that will stop you getting into a fight that you'll lose because you're behind. Like actually having like the fucking longsword, like if he's already ahead of you, like at best you're only going to be even there. You're probably going to be behind in attack damage anyway. So if you go into a blind fog of war, he's just going to fucking kill you. You're going to be behind 2 kills down, mate, and even worse. But then again, unfortunately, that involves telling players to not think of this minute, but to think 5 minutes in the future, which. That's half the battle right there. That is half the battle.
If you can do that, you can probably win. Even if they're planning the wrong things, just having the plan in advance is going to put them above a lot of players. So
yes.
Okay, so I now want to go back to the vision stuff. And
let's do it.
One thing I remembered just now is I'm not 100% sure, but I think Samsung Blue was one of the first teams that actually Heart went to mid lane after the first resets, because this is something, this has fluctuated throughout the years. Like 3 years ago, I don't know, season 6, 7, 8, this was mandatory. The first reset of the sport, if you don't go mid, your contract is in shambles, where you're kicked out of the team, right? Nowadays, actually, it changes a lot because people have gotten much smarter about wave state. Like, I have to go back to the wave. Like, I can live without vision control on lower mid for 30 seconds because I have priority on the river from bot lane then and not from mid lane. But I remember specifically, I think Samsung Blue actually started this trend that Heart, after the first recall, would always go mid. And first of all, people would say, why was he doing it? He's losing EXP. I remember Vandra, he's losing EXP. It's not effective. And I'm like, well, in theory, thanks to this, in 30 seconds, their mid laner can go help you on the bot lane, right? So this is a kind of a chess move, right? It's a tempo advantage.
You unlock the mid, basically.
It's a sacrifice for now, right? Yeah. So basically, I think Samsung Blue was one of the first teams to do this. And now, the way I think I see why Samsung White was able to do this better, because I guess Heart started doing that every game. Mata started doing that every game, but then Mata thought, but why am I doing this alone? right? So it would seem logical to go that way, right?
I'll even throw in there. Oh, say it. Go ahead, Kelsey.
I was just gonna say, and almost all the things that we're bringing up, like we're saying pressure, like using resets to go mid, like these types of concepts. It's like they're all evidence that this team like understood tempo before people even started talking about it in season 6, right? Which
and synchronization, I think this is intuition, right? What you're saying now, because tempo is new, right? And compared to 2014, right? But what you're saying is right here. That's why I think they were better. I think they intuitively knew that they had to synchronize nicely, and they had a tempo advantage, right? For example, or a disadvantage they have to play around, right?
I'll even throw in there again, like just as context. Another reason why it makes sense they'd be the ones that come up with this innovation is whereas Mata was famously the shot caller. I mean, as Kelsey just alluded to, he's basically done it in every team he's been in and had insane influence over the teams because everyone thinks back to his glory days. Supposedly in Samsung Blue, like Dade did a lot of that stuff. Like that was one of the things. Like he was one of those rare mid laners that apparently had a lot of influence.
Oh, that's interesting because
you could imagine in that scenario, maybe he tells the support to come up and at this moment, maybe they synchronize in that way.
And that's interesting. You're right. Hart fell off, right? Like, what did Hart do later after?
He became a coach later.
Actually, a lot of the Chinese players that worked with Hart praised him a lot. I think the reason he because I thought he was like actually one of the best supports in LPL when he was there. Even like his mechanics were like, I think some of those Samsung players, like like Deft, for example, their mechanics got better when they came to China because they were just like constantly playing these fights, right? Like constantly playing these skirmishes and these fights. So even though he was old, like I think his mechanics like improved slightly. But he ended up retiring just because people said that he was too old, right? Like you're too old to play some more. So he did end up coaching. He wasn't, I would say, like
I don't know how I forgot that actually.
Yeah, the reflection is actually that he's wasn't like people didn't praise him that much as a coach. But as a player, like there was a lot of praise for him and what he told the other players to do and how he helped them. So,
I just remember right now because you're talking about coaches. For some reason, I remember Koma is in China, right? But why I'm thinking about this now? Because why we can see that there's a quantified moment in which this changes is SKT with Bengi and Faker, right? What was the whole team and everybody talking about? It's always Bengi plus Faker, just synergy that happened. Nobody knows from where. Right, because that shows how the game state and the game knowledge was back then, right? Oh yeah, it's a mid laner. The jungler ganks for him, or they just have stronger 2v2, so they control the map. That was the approach, right? They win 2v2. So what can you do? You can't win. But then it comes in Samsung Blue and Samsung White, and they're like, okay, but you can win mid thanks to the support and the jungler, or you can screw mid and win one side of the map really hard. And you can play more around the side lanes. And I think that's when they found out that freezing actually could be something useful because I think like back then, like at least in Europe, in the LCS, most of the time it was just if you can push the opponent, you're good. That was the Forgiven play style. Forgiven used to play with unlimited back then, right? They used to play every game like Caitlyn Zyra and Sullivan Vander would be like pulling out their hairs like, what can we do? Right? Because they're better and they have better champions, right? So I think Samsung Blue and the swap approach appeared, right? And this shows that don't always mindlessly push because the only person that was talking about freezing in the old days was Wicked, like a really long time ago.
Yes.
Everybody forgot about the concept later on because it doesn't work. And then I think Samsung Blue and probably Korea was the whole as a region as a whole was the region that started again thinking about freezes. It's funny because probably in 5 years we'll be like, yeah, LS and the freezing in mid games. Yeah, he was right.
Of course. It'll be the Time Lord. Yeah, exactly.
Situationally, it's happening, yeah.
So LS is the new Samsung Blue in 5 years, right?
Potentially.
If I was an absolute attention whore, that would obviously just be the title of the video, just to get all the clicks in the entire. Except the sad thing is, they'd watch it and be like, "They never even mentioned LS in this for the first hour. What the fuck?" What else?
Yeah,
is there another area we should go on this topic? Is there another area we should go on this topic, Kelsey?
So I guess there's like not a whole lot that I would say left. Yeah, I think it's just really interesting. Also, just watching how that team kind of fell apart and when they went to China, because I think both teams, like the way that it was happened, right? Like teams would buy like two of them or they would buy one of them, right? And then when they came to China and they couldn't just like play the same way together with their Chinese teammates, right? So they couldn't just win worlds because like the knowledge advantage that they had there didn't really translate. So you saw like this black hole that came about just because we sort of lost that strategy. We lost the super team. So for like at the end of season 4, the Korean Exodus, it was you lose the super team system, or not the super team, the sister team system, right?
Yeah.
So there's not like there's not a way to like have this kind of strategy that's isolated to just you, and then you lose the built-in like teamwork and the systems that they had together like as units. So you have these teams that lose their talent and like their best teams in Korea. So Korea itself looked like dog shit in 2015 to an extent, and then like China also looks like dog shit because you took these talented, smart players and put them in situations where they couldn't really be effective. So it was just a really. It just shows that there was like a complete misunderstanding of what made those teams good at the time.
Yeah, because I mean, basically, to translate some of that, basically the Chinese teams just thought, oh, this is the best top laner, I'll buy him, and now I have the best top laner. Oh, this is the best jungler, and then they would like, wait a minute, he's not as good as he seemed to be. That's also how you know, by the way, to play into what Veggie was saying, that's how you know some of it was figured out intuitively, like they didn't sit down and like crack a formula, because otherwise they would have just taken the formula and told all their teammates in China, and then they would have, like you said, they would have just won worlds again with just someone else's AD carry. One thing I was going to say from before, that I forgot was when Veggie there said about, because that's the other key thing that's kind of lost in the mix here, is this was the last year of the sister team system. And that was an approach in Korea, which very famously, I think was one of the main reasons they were so absurdly dominant, because it also allowed you to like, not only could you practice in a way that to this day, top teams do not scrim, where you, listen, you can ask the other team if they're sort of friends, like the two coaches are friends or the team's friends. Maybe you can ask them to play certain comps, but they're not going to like play out like a dummy run scenario in a scrim and let you practice something over it. Like they're just not going to do that. If you have a sister team, you can, and they did do that. Like that was a thing that they would actually practice. And then I also heard
it's actually easier to not have leaks. Like you have the intellectual property kind of approach, where if you live with the guy, you're going to have a better, you're going to have better, not synergy, but you're going to be more talking more to him than probably some guy that's not in your team house, right? So you're not going to say then and leak scrims or leak, oh yeah, we're doing this now to your friend Faker, right? It's harder to do that mentally.
And then the other part, so go on.
And you don't have those like bargaining situations. So it's like, can we please open this champion this round because no one is getting to play it, right? Like this type of things. You don't have to like bargain with the other team where they aren't incentivized to do it because they know that they're just going to ban it on the day. You have the stories with like Young Buck and Fnatic in, I think it was 2017, where they just drilled, or 2018 actually, where they just drilled level 1s over and over again and kept resetting the game. And then after like a couple of weeks, no one wanted to scrim them, but you can't do that, right?
Yes.
So it's just like kind of a lot of those potential is just lost. So it's kind of disappointing.
And then also the other part was, obviously, like Veggie says here, you can essentially keep some of what you figure out mainly in-house. Like you don't show a lot of that to the others. And that's actually one area where I don't think they did this consciously. But apparently from all the rumors I heard back in the day and people who played them in boot camps and stuff, actually, the way that those teams scrimmed also meant the information didn't get out. Because apparently Samsung White used to just scrim super disrespectfully and do stupid shit like Impamata for fun would just pick like a worse bot lane and just beat you with it. Just be like, haha, idiot, you think this was a good scrim? Like, I'd never do this in a real game, but you're shit, I'm better than you. So you don't get anything from that. You just get stomped and you go like, fuck, they're just better than me. And then Samsung Blue supposedly were just terrible in scrims. Like supposedly it's Samsung Blue that gave all the fuckers from NA like Cloud9 and TSM all the hope that they actually could do shit at these tournaments, because they'd go over there and they'd win and be like, aren't these guys supposed to be the champions? Like, we're probably going to win worlds. And then the problem was, like, that was just how they were in a scrim, but apparently in real games they just zoned in and they would do. So they had like the opposite ends of the scrim problem, where both sets of scrims are worthless. But the worst thing is, if you're an outside person, you're thinking that that's them practicing. You don't know that's them probably just playing like to play you and get information to keep their like skills up. But the real practice they just do against each other. or another thing in Korea as well is they also would have teams that kind of had a similar relationship that was separate. Like, these two coaches used to be in a team together, so they will keep stuff in-house to some degree. That has to be a big advantage, because remember, this time in the West, nobody has a second team. People didn't even have challenger teams back then. So you're just a guy on your own with your team. And as we said, there's nothing exists like this. So it's not even like the West were idiots and couldn't do it. Like, you literally couldn't do this. Like, you couldn't practice this way. You couldn't even conceptualize the game this way.
Yeah, and there was a big barrier with macro between teams, even in the LCS. Like, as I said, a lot of teams didn't know how to end the games. This was like, you'd hear this all the time in the States, in LCS, right? That, yeah, like, they always get an advantage, but the game just drags on, right? Like, back then, there was a quantified difference between the best team and the worst team in the macro. Nowadays, it's more about players' creativity, and actually, you play the macro out according to your play style. Like, play style is more important. Like, I have this player, so I can't play this macro way, but I have another macro way that I can play with, because macro knowledge is so good now that I know that I can win the game in a different way, right? So nowadays, like, macro is completely different, right? Like, macro is so subjective nowadays compared to how it was back then. Back then, when you had, like, the Korean teams and they were just dominating us, right? The only thing you could say was, yeah, well, we just don't know, there's better in macro. So the only thing you could do was copy them. There was no other way to win apart from, like, Gambit, whatever. Sure. But one thing I also remembered what you said now with the high hopes of Americans, right, and Europeans against Samsung Blue and Scrims. I still think that TSM was a top 4 team at that tournament. They just got really unlucky with Samsung White. Really, that was probably TSM's best shot, honestly, right? Unfortunately, never to come again, right?
It's kind of subjective as to whether it's unfortunate or not.
It's been too much time. I can't really comment on that. I mean, I thought that I had like certain feelings about OMG as well, but that team was like such a fucking disaster anyway, so it didn't matter.
This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Dean Tanglis, Emanuel Särnbratt, JDubs, NateDOhDoubleG, the Puyallup Tribe, Tobias Bernasconi, Xinged, and a special thanks always goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my shows? Maybe ask a question in my monthly video AMA? Do you want teasers? Who are the guests on my next content? Maybe you want to take part in one of those donated discussions with me where we go really deep into the weeds. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today in the description box link below.